Hi everyone and welcome. I'm down here in my wormery, and over here is the window to my basement nearest my worm collection. And my worm collection consists of various types of worms. Some of them are red wigglers, some of them are European night crawlers, but there's one type of worm in my wormery which is a tropical type of a worm. They're the ones that you see here on the left side of my shelf. It's the African night crawlers. I abbreviate that by just writing the three letters ANC. I've got ANCs down here as well. And overnight, I believe the temperatures dropped pretty low, and with that window open all night, my only concern is that hopefully things didn't get too cool down here for these little guys, since they do favor warmer temperatures. And as the temperatures get cooler and cooler as we make our way out of the summer months, I'm going to have to be a little bit more careful, making sure that I don't let these little guys get into sort of a overly cold situation that could ultimately be harmful for them. So these two bins were being maintained concurrently for a while, up until as recently as 1 week ago when we checked in on the older bin. We weren't feeding it anymore because we were already kind of in what I refer to as a foraging state with the older bin. But we did feed the younger bin, and this younger bin I believe is now 39 days old of age. So it's not very old. It's about 5.5 weeks old at this point. I believe it's already received 5 feedings, and after a week, since that last feeding they got was not very large, I believe they're probably due for some food. And I'm also just curious to see how they're doing after I left that window open and let things cool down in here a little bit last night. So I'm going to get these guys up on the bench today. We're not going to bother with them up here because we dealt with them a few days ago. We initiated the migration of the worms out of the compost. So we're in the finishing stages of this bin, but this bin is really just kind of warming up and getting started after only about a month in service. So we're only going to be checking in on the new bin today. So let me put on a glove and we'll get this bin up on the bench and see how things look in there. So when I was filming earlier and I was approaching the shelf, you may have noticed that this bin, as well as a couple other bins, have plastic coverings. Others don't. And I usually reserve the use of plastic coverings to situations where I'm actively trying to preserve the moisture content of the bin versus allowing some of the moisture to vaporize on its own as a result of evaporation. And since this bin is still pretty young, my assumption is that the majority of the material that makes up this bin is still fairly loose bedding type materials, and it's for that reason that I'm continuing to use plastic coverings here. But I'll probably do that only for a little while. It's always kind of interesting when I'm tending to a somewhat larger breed of worm. I started out my worm composting with fairly small size worms, the red wigglers. I've also got some other types of worms that are fairly small, the Indian blue worms, but I remember even when I first got European night crawlers, how I would always be kind of taken aback by their size when I first spotted one when I opened up my bin. But we're starting to see a couple worms hanging out here on the surface. These African night crawlers are a pretty good sized worm, a little bit larger than I'm accustomed to having in my wormery. And I saw a couple hanging out here near the surface, so I thought I'd just bring them out for show so we can take a closer look at them. They look pretty lively and mobile. My thought was that maybe in the cold that they would sort of hunker down and try to preserve their energy or something, but it does appear like they're not too disturbed by the temperatures down here. I'm sure if it had gotten a lot cooler they would have reacted a little differently. But they seem to be okay, so I think, some of my concerns for these little guys are kind of fading away at this point. But I do feel like I might need to find a spot for these little guys that is maybe even closer to my furnace or close to my hot water heater or near some sort of ductwork or something where there's heat flowing through it, just to keep things warmer for these guys. So it's just something that's been riding on my mind lately as temperatures drop. And since down here in my basement there's no climate control, I just want to make sure that things don't become inhospitable for these little guys. I guess the one thing I'm noticing here as I start to probe around even before I started probing around, was I noticed a lot of these little minuscule flying insects. I'm not sure if they're showing up on the video or not, but I do see a number of fairly tiny little fruit flies or something. I don't know what they are, but they're very fast moving, tiny flying insects. I mean, I see a couple dozen of them here and there. I thought I saw a few roaming around within the material here as I pulled back. So I don't think we're in a problem state here, but I don't know, maybe something to keep an eye on as time progresses. Make sure it doesn't get out of hand. So I'm just going to start peeling back some of this material that coats the top surface of my bin here. This bin has all kinds of paper and cardboard and all kinds of carbon-based bedding type materials floating around in it. And it kind of makes me wonder, why didn't I cover up this bin with a whole bunch of fresh leaves last time we were in here? It could have possibly been that I was just out of leaves at that time. But I usually try to give my bins a sort of a nice natural top covering using leaves. And we'll probably do that today because I'm fairly sure that my leaf supply box is pretty much full or close to being full. So I believe one thing that they're going to get today as part of their feeding is a nice top covering of leaves over the top of the bin. Now, the last time we fed, as we usually do in my bins, we fed down the middle of the bin over here. And the stuff that they got was a package of frozen cauliflower. I don't remember how much it was, maybe half a pound. They got some coffee, which is one of the staple foods that my worms typically get down here in my wormery. And a little shrimpy worm. So I'm just taking a moment here to take a closer look at this smaller size worm because I did recently, it was the day after we fed this bin here when we gave this bin a package of frozen cauliflower. I had a second package of that frozen cauliflower, and I fed the following day in another of my bins, a bin that's got these Indian blue worms in them. And the Indian blue worms just freaked out. And I think it was because I had tilled up their environment so much that I had a whole bunch of Indian blues crawling the walls of their container. And they were on a shelf right above this one. And my concern was that I'm, allowing the Indian blues to kind of drop out of their home container into another container that they don't really belong in. And I know that one way to identify the Indian blue worm is to look for their clitellum, which is very, very flush with their body, almost invisible, making you think that you're looking at sort of a juvenile red worm, but it's a fully mature Indian blue worm. And the only thing that I guess about this worm that doesn't really seem like a blue worm is that it's not very fast moving. I mean, if it was a red wiggler, it would have kind of a yellow tail. And I do see kind of what appears to be its clitellum here, so I'm starting to wonder if what I've got here is actually an Indian blue worm. I'm going to be keeping an eye on that because I do want this to remain as a bin of African night crawlers, and I don't want to have the Indian blues take over in here. But when I got this batch of worms, I was also informed that I was getting a bunch of juvenile African night crawlers as well as a bunch of cocoons coming along for the ride as well. So I don't know if what I'm looking at here is possibly just a juvenile African night crawler. I don't know. Maybe just based on its movement, the fact that it's not zipping around like the Energizer Bunny. Maybe it is just an African night crawler, but a slightly smaller one that's still got some growing to do. Decisions. I don't know. When I saw that little shrimpy worm, I just started to wonder if it was maybe a worm that doesn't really belong in here. Let me just grab another worm from here. So if this is an African night crawler, this worm right next to it, I don't know. Just trying to compare color schemes and movement and behavior, stuff like that. Maybe I've got nothing to worry about here. I guess I'm in a slightly paranoid mode right now just because of what I had happen with my blue worms. It's not really a container of blue worms exclusively. From what I understand, it's that mix that you get from Uncle Jim's Worm Farm. I got the worms from another worm farmer in exchange for some of my own worms out of my wormery, and I later found out that what I was receiving from him was a container of worms that had originated from Uncle Jim's Worm Farm. And it's pretty common knowledge that when you get the worms from Uncle Jim's Worm Farm and you're ordering what you believe to be red wigglers, you usually end up with a container full of not just red wigglers, but also blue worms and European night crawlers, kind of a mix of different types of composting worms. So let's just start looking at these worms. Again, I'm just kind of in a slightly paranoid state, trying to see if I can observe any worms that appear to be blue worms. Because if they run amok in here, they could take over the entire environment and kind of squeeze the other worms out. But all right, I feel like I'm just taking a little bit more time here than I need to. I don't know, I just find this relaxing, so I sometimes do take a little bit more time doing this stuff than is absolutely necessary. Let's get a move on. This is a chunk of banana peel. Was one of the items that was added to the feeding last time. So besides the cauliflower, there was also banana peel added. So there's little chunks of that remaining in here, as I can see, as well as the stem. It does seem to me like they've done a number on this thing, though, because a lot of times after only a week, a banana peel is still somewhat intact, but that one seems like it's falling apart already. And I think pretty obviously, too, what I started out there with when I started this excavation, I started pulling out this remnant, and here's another remnant of it, of the egg carton that had been placed down here as bedding as well. So I figured I would try to preserve the egg carton if possible and use it as the basis of today's feeding, kind of the foundation that I like to place down underneath the food when I add it. Look at the size of this worm. Again, I'm sorry, I just can't seem to help gawking at these African night crawlers, especially when I spot a really, really large one. You definitely get your money's worth. If you're getting African night crawlers from the place where these worms came from, Northeast Worms from Gaetano, they're just monstrous worms. Well fed, well cared for, large, healthy African night crawlers. And now that this bin is over a month in service, and as the baby worms start to emerge from their cocoons, I'm sure we're going to start seeing a kind of a mix of not just adult worms in here, but also babies cruising around, juveniles and stuff like that. And I'm thinking of trying something that I saw done on another worm channel as well. Over on the World Composting channel, Newell has been trying to follow the advice of one of the viewers, and I'm thinking of doing the same in order to preserve the size of your nice big large African night crawlers, because once the baby worms start to zip around the container, they sort of begin to compete with the adult worms for the food supply or something. I don't know if it's really food supply or competitiveness or what it is, but somehow the presence of the baby worms stifles the growth of the adult worms, or I think it might even cause fairly large adult worms to lose body size and mass for some reason. You know, I can't explain it beyond that, so don't ask me to. It's just advice from another viewer in the comments of my videos, suggesting that the way to avoid that happening is to begin relocating your large adult African night crawlers into an environment of their own, so that they can not get into that competitive mode with the babies as the babies begin to emerge from their cocoons and start growing and taking up space in the bin. So something I've been thinking of doing, same as what Newell did recently in his African night crawler bin, is to begin relocating the large adults out of this container into a fresh new box But I'm not really prepared to start into that today. And I haven't even mentioned the process yet until now, I don't think. But it is something that I've been considering doing as well. It'd be kind of interesting to maybe compare notes with how Newell does on the World Composting Channel relative to how I do here, if we're able to in fact preserve the nice large size of these African night crawlers and not let them dwindle in size. So that's something I've been thinking of doing, but in order for that to be possible, I would have to set up a new environment for the adult worms and begin gradually relocating them. So that's something I might do later today. I might take some material out of this bin and use it as sort of an inoculant to bring over some of the beneficial bacteria and microbes and fungi and stuff that inhabit this bin already, to sort of get that bin, that new bin, primed. It's a new bin that I haven't built yet, so it's something that I'm thinking of doing, and I might actually jump into that later today after we're done feeding these little guys. But I'm going on and on here. Once again, I'm getting a little bit sidetracked just by wanting to check out the worms and chit chat, but I believe we've got ourselves a good enough large space here down the middle of the bin to apply today's feeding. So why don't we just go a little bit further before I run upstairs to the fridge to grab some food for them. We'll begin returning some of this egg carton back down into the feeding area. Curious to see how much of it remains. I mean, I'm sure most of it's here. It's just a question of sort of reassembling it to see how much of it I was able to preserve. And it's not terribly important, but I'm just a curious type. I try to see sometimes if I can observe the time it takes for certain types of materials to break down in my worm bins, and I was just curious about this this cardboard that makes up these egg cartons. Because on another worm channel, on Marty's Garden, that guy down in Australia who's got a really cool worm channel as well, he puts these egg cartons into his worm systems, and his worms go bananas for this stuff. And it does seem like every time I go into my bin here to check on these African night crawlers and I check inside of each of these cells that had eggs in them, I do find good amounts of worms hanging out in them. And I don't know if this just they like the nice cozy space, or besides the food that has dropped down into it, maybe they're also enjoying the cardboard itself as a carbon-based food source or what, but it does seem like they're gradually working it down. But it was only 2 feedings ago that I placed this in here, and it still seems like it's holding up pretty good. It feels like I was able to reassemble a good portion of it. But as time goes on, I believe that it's going to continue deteriorating, and it might become harder and harder for me to identify pieces of it and fish it out. So I figured I would give it a try, at least this time, and maybe in future check-ins we're not going to bother with it so much, but it seemed like enough of it was intact that I would see what I could do about rebuilding the foundation for today's feeding with that stuff if possible. And it looks like we managed to do just that. So I'm going to take a little break now, head upstairs to the fridge and grab them a little something to eat that we could drop in here for them, and then we'll pick up where we left off when I get back. Now, if you're a regular on my channel, then the coffee should be no surprise. Coffee is a pretty staple feeding for all my worm bins, pretty much every feeding. And the rest of the stuff that's in here is the peels of some cucumber, maybe even the butt end of a couple pieces of cucumber, and this stuff over here are potato peels. And it's a pretty good sizable feeding, comparable to what they received a week ago. Other stuff they're getting today is some shredded newspaper as the bedding foundation of their feeding, not just some of the recycled bedding that's down low the egg carton, but some fresh bedding of not only newspaper but also some leaves. Put a handful or so of leaves in here to go with the paper, and I believe I've got enough in this box to do a nice covering at the end. So we'll bring the box of leaves back later, and we'll give this whole environment a nice thorough covering of leaves across the top, which is something that the worms are going to probably appreciate it as well. And the other thing that they're going to get is some pulverized eggshell. The pulverized eggshell is what I use as my source of grit when I'm feeding my worms. The grit is just something that the worms need for their digestion of the food that they consume. And I don't know, some people say that it's not even necessary. I've seen various tests on various worm channels. I believe Anne over on Plant Obsessed channel, or even over on the London Worm and Garden channel. I've seen examples of bins run with absolutely no grit at all. No eggshell, no sand, no crushed crustacean shell, no nothing, no rock dust. No form of grit whatsoever, and the worms all seem to do just fine without it. But if it helps them break the foods down that they get, then I'm all for giving it to them. And in addition to that, it's just another way for me to get rid of more compostable materials in my worm bins by giving them eggs or egg shells as the form of grit that they use in their feeding. So we're looking pretty good here. A nice generous feeding. It had some good weight to it, like I mentioned earlier. Perhaps even more than what they received a week ago. A week ago I did sort of sense that what they were getting was not that much. So I knew that I'd be back in here in about a week's time. But sometimes I don't, check in so frequently on my bins. Sometimes I'll let it go 8-10 days, sometimes longer between feedings. But on this go around, I think it was timely to come back in here after a week to give them some more food and help keep the process moving. Keep these little guys well fed and happy. So I guess this coffee filter is also going to end up becoming just more bedding / carbon food for these little guys. A lot of people will tell you that when it comes to African night crawlers, they might even prefer the carbon-based foods, the leaves, paper, stuff like that, over the nitrogen-rich kitchen scraps, the veggies, the coffee, the fruits. And that does seem to be true here as well. I mean, a lot of the bedding I used last time is barely visible anymore. Some of the stuff that they got last week was a pretty good pile of little chunks of cardboard, similar to what you see here. We'll throw these in too, as long as they're here. But I had topped off the feeding last time with a bunch of this stuff. And while I saw a couple chunks of it while I was picking through, I don't think I saw much. So it does seem like they did a pretty good job on the cardboard that was placed in here last time. So let's give them just a little bit more grit. I recently made more. I've got more eggshells that I can pulverize further to make more as well. So I got no problem being generous with the grit. Here's a piece of that paper or cardboard. Or maybe I just ended up pushing it all off to the side. Is that why it seems like they ate it all? Sometimes I trick myself. But yeah, this is, like I said earlier, a fairly young bin. And it's no surprise that as we look through this material that we're going to find an abundance of bedding type materials no matter where we look. And then at some point in the near future it'll change. It'll start becoming predominantly castings. Then at some point we'll have to find these little guys a new home. But as far as the adult worms in here and giving them a new home, moving them away from the baby worms, yeah, I'm definitely thinking of doing that here as well, and see if it works. It would be kind of a shame to see all my big, huge northeast worms, African night crawlers, dwindle down into little puny worms. So I like the idea of giving all these big monster ANCs a new home so they can remain nice and large, and it'll be just fun to have big fat ANCs in my wormery to check in on once in a while. So I'm going to do what I normally do, is I'm going to just inspect the rest of my bin as long as we're in here. And I just hope that by doing so I don't trigger a reaction like I got in my other bin last week, where all the worms just start going bananas and trying to squirm out of the container. I do feel like that reaction was triggered by me just tilling through the bin and kind of causing such a disruption that it triggered that sort of flight behavior in the worms. So I probably will come down here in a little while just to check on them, just to make sure I haven't caused that sort of behavior in here as well. I mean, who knows? It's something I could have been doing all along for a long time now. But if that was the case, I think I probably would have seen signs of that in the form of dead worms all over the floor and stuff. So maybe I don't have too much to worry about. Maybe it's just the blue worms in that other bin that are a little bit skittish and have a tendency to react that way. And now I know. Now I'll just be a little bit more ginger with them in the future. You know, or take steps to try to keep them in their bin and not let them crawl out and meet their doom. But yeah, things look really nice in here. Nice and fluffy. Lots of castings starting to get deposited all over the place throughout this bin. And I just have to also remind myself that when these African night crawlers arrived in the mail, the packaging material that they came in was a whole bunch of peat moss too. So I also don't want to mistake any of the peat moss that might still be in here from that as castings. It might just still be a whole bunch of leftover peat moss. Maybe this is just some leftover coffee. It's pretty easy to talk yourself into being a little bit further along than you actually are when you're inspecting the materials in your bin. So I try to give myself a little reality check once in a while, just so I don't get myself all jazzed thinking that I'm much further along in my worm bins than I actually am. So I don't want to go too crazy here. I do feel like giving, you know, your worm bins a good ample amount of bedding all the time is a smart thing to do. The worms definitely seem to appreciate it, and especially these night crawlers. But I just don't want to reach the capacity of these bins too quickly. With this only being maybe the 6th feeding, in bins this size I typically go, you know, a dozen or more feedings, maybe up to 15 feedings is where we got to last time with the other ANC bin that I just recently got done foraging in and just started the migration of the worms in. And I think 15 is a good number in terms of trying to squeeze in 15 good sizable feedings in a worm bin before it comes time to start thinking about bringing a close to that bin's life cycle. And that's specific to bins this size and feedings my size and worm populations my size. That whole thing of 15 feedings is just very specific to my conditions and my type of, or my style of worm composting. So it's certainly something that you have to sort of arrive at on your own in terms of what works best for your worm composting environment. But we're pretty much done here. I'm just covering up in a way that I don't create too much of a blockage of airflow down into the material. Although, you know, you saw this stuff, it's pretty light and fluffy and has lots of air cavities throughout, so I don't think we're quite in that condition yet where we can possibly risk turning into a dangerous anaerobic environment where there's, you know, insufficient airflow or oxygen for the worms in the material. But still, I want to put down enough plastic so that it creates a nice recirculation of the moisture that would otherwise evaporate out of the bin and keep things nice and damp and cozy for these little guys in here. Alright everyone, that's the end of the video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please remember to leave me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And hopefully we'll see you back here next time. Oh yeah, don't forget, if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.